Thank you, Ben, and thank you for paying me in advance. I think you might more prudently wait until you've heard me before you decide whether to applaud or not. I've enjoyed this banana belt experience here in South Dakota this week, and I've told the previous audiences that I have been traveling for the past month or so in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, in sub-zero weather, and I was very, very happy at last to get into a state that's got South in its name. They protest a little bit that you've had some cold weather here in South Dakota, but after seeing the beautiful sun on the crystal horizon this morning, I can't believe that you ever have inclement weather in South Dakota. Doesn't correspond at all to my experience. So I congratulate you for your southern climate. But what I want to talk about is the terrible fix that farmers are in, and the terrible fix that the Farmers Union is in. I hate to bring bad news, but it is bad. Wheat is the price bellwether of American agriculture. Wheat prices in November averaged 49% of parity. The average of all farmers' prices is 66% of parity, and it's been lower than that this year. Farm prices this year will have the lowest average purchasing power since before Roosevelt was elected president. Now that's the real buying power of what you produce. And I think that the reference to the election of Franklin Roosevelt as president, as how far back we have to go to get to a comparably poor situation, is of more than merely coincidental interest. I think it's a very important historical fact that has considerable significance, and I'll talk about that later. Of course, we have fewer farmers now than we did 50 years ago or 40 years ago, but nevertheless, the real purchasing power of the average income of the average farmer in the United States now is about as low as it's been since the 30s, since the Depression, notwithstanding that we have only a third as many farmers. The average net income per farm this year is running right around $7,500. And if you adjust that for inflation only back to 1967, to 10 years ago, it's only $4,080 in real income in 1967 dollars. Now that isn't very much for net income of a farming enterprise that represents a capital investment of $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 per farm. And that's the return that the farmer gets for all his labor and all his management and the return on his investment. $7,500 of today's cheap dollars, only $4,000 of the more valuable dollars of 10 years ago. That's a very, very poor return. Total net income of all farmers this year is running at around $21 billion of current dollars. In real purchasing power, that's about as low as farm income has been for several decades. Notwithstanding that farmers are producing more efficiently, and there are fewer farmers than ever. Nevertheless, that's a pretty poor picture. Farmers' net income of $21 billion is just a shade more than the total increase in farm debt this year, $16 billion. What that means is that farmers aren't borrowing money to expand. An economist would say that's generally a healthy thing. If farmers were borrowing money to expand production because they thought that they could make money and pay interest and pay off the loans on what they borrow. But the fact is that most of what farmers are borrowing is simply to transfer land from one generation to another, and a lot of it is to borrowing to cover losses. And it's possible only because land values are increasing and farmers are borrowing against the increased value of their land in order to cover the losses on their operations this year. And I have to say that the expectation that they'll be able to pay the interest on the debts they have and to pay off the loans that they have already and the new loans they're making is pretty poor. So we're in a desperate situation. The administration has said that the government will not support farm prices at a profitable level because that will make the price of land go up. And then family farmers can't afford to buy farms. Well, now that to me seems just about as silly as anything I've heard for a long time. I do not understand how people can make a go at the level of returns that this administration has proposed. $2.67 an hour return on labor and a 1.5% return on investment in land. Now, I'd like to have somebody in the government or anybody else explain to me how a young farmer can borrow money, most of what he'll have to pay at today's market values for land, plus equipment, plus livestock, and that's what a young farmer has to do if he's going to start out farming. He isn't likely to start out with a very big equity. How can he borrow the money to start farming and get prices that will yield him only a 1.5% return on his investment, on what he's paid for his land and his equipment and livestock, at 9.5% and 10% if he's only going to get a return of 1.5% on his investment? It just can't be done. Now, what that means is that instead of helping family farmers get the land, that's going to mean that nobody can afford to own land or to farm except somebody who doesn't need to make money on it. And that is the hoarders, the land hoarders. There's a lot of those in the world today, and the reason that there is so much hoarding is because people are worried about the terrible economic situation. People are worried about the political situation in other countries and even here in the United States. And so they are willing to put their money into gold and either dig it down in a hole in the garden and hide it, or hire somebody to stand guard over it in a vault and pay storage charges on it. You don't earn money on owning gold, but you might have a chance to save or keep most of the wealth that you invest in the gold. And that's why gold is a natural attraction for hoarders. But very much the same thing with land. Anybody who looks at what's happening to world population and understands the world economy knows that if civilization survives, we have got to have more food. The only way we can avoid having more food is for civilization to collapse and people to die by the hundreds of millions, literally, and to stop the increase in population. Nothing short of a disaster for the human race will prevent the necessity to have more food. And there isn't going to be any more land to produce it on. And so land appeals to the hoarder who's afraid that his country is going communist in Italy or Central Europe or France, or who's afraid that the economy is going to collapse in whatever country it is, or who's afraid that the whole world system is going to collapse if he has oil money from Arabia or Kuwait or countries of that kind. And so these are the land hoarders, people who are afraid of political and economic disaster. And they are the rich doctors and the rich lawyers and the rich businessmen and the rich salesmen and the rich advertising executives who are making more money than they can spend for fun and living expenses, and they want to salt it away someplace. And the stock market looks like a lousy place to put it, and the bank deposits look like a pretty lousy place to put it, because inflation is going faster than the interest rates, and so they are buying land to hoard land. And they are the only people who can afford to own land if the return on land is less than it costs to own it. Because the family farmer who's got to feed his family and educate his family on what he can earn on the land can't afford to own and farm farms if the return is less than it costs him to own it. Well, we wonder, of course, why the low prices. The low farm prices of today, the lowest since Franklin Roosevelt was elected a long time ago, are made in Washington, D.C. The low prices are now keyed to the world market, but the world market price is made in Washington, D.C. 75% or more of the food that is produced and consumed in this world brings to the farmers who produce it prices substantially higher than the American farmers are getting for food. Every government in the world, except the United States, is supporting their farmers at substantially higher price levels than in the United States, or would like to do it if they could afford to do it, if the United States government's policy wasn't busting the world market price. The farmers of Australia, Canada, Argentina are dependent on the world market price. The Canadians do have a two-price system, and they charge their own consumers a little more for bread than the world market price most of the time. Same with Australia. Argentina can't do very much, and their government is very unstable and just now kind of getting on its feet, both economically and politically. But every one of those governments would like to see farm prices higher than they are. But they can't do it because the United States accounts for over half of all the grain that moves in world trade, and the United States is busting the world price. Canada is next, and Canada exports only 1/4 as much grain. I'm talking about all grain now, wheat, feed grains, rice, only 1/4 as much as the United States, and obviously Canada, with only 1/4 as big export as ours, can't be the price leader. Australia and Argentina together account for only about another 1/4 as much as we do. In that kind of a situation, the world market price is going to be made by the United States price, and as we in the Farmers Union have known for a long time, the price of grain in the United States is made by the U.S. price support loan rate. And that is where the world price is made, and that is where the 20% of the food that is produced in the exporting countries is priced, in Washington, D.C. Well, what about this? Why? We wonder why. Why should the United States government, which has the power to set the world price, determine to give away our grain as cheaply as it is, the cheapest prices in real terms since Roosevelt was elected president? One of the excuses we hear is we've got to stay competitive in the world market. The Farmers Union, and I personally, know the people in these other governments, the other exporting countries, who compete with us in the world market. I have talked personally with members of the Canadian Wheat Board and other people in the Canadian government, as well as Canadian farm organization leaders. We had a 2-day conference a week ago in Minneapolis with the leaders of the Canadian farm organizations. We have been in correspondence and in communication with officials in the Canadian, in the Australian government and in the Australian farm organizations. I spent over an hour in a conversation with the Secretary of Agriculture of Argentina down in Buenos Aires just a few weeks ago. And in every case, I am convinced and explicitly have been assured by those officials that they would follow the United States price lead if we would raise our loan rate on grain in order to raise the world market price. They wouldn't undersell us. And here's something new. They all agree, without exception, that their governments would help their farmers or help their own national price support systems to hold reserves off the market so that they could hold a fair share of the world's reserve off the market to keep it from depressing the price below a reasonable U.S. price support loan rate to establish the floor under the world market price. Here we have a situation where the exporting countries are ready to cooperate, with the sole exception of the United States. Who is the competition that's busting the world price? It's Uncle Sam. It's the United States. It is we ourselves who are our own competition. And that's a phony excuse. We also hear another excuse that there's a terrible crushing surplus of grain in the world. Some of you who have long memories can remember all the way back to 1974 when a World Food Congress was held in Rome, when the whole world was going crazy with fear that we were running out of food. Do you remember way back to 1974? Well, we've had a good crop for a couple of years. And so now we have a crushing surplus. That's a phony surplus. It's a fiction. It's an excuse that is being used to justify keeping the price down for the farmers. The reality of it is that our world food situation is tight. It is tight. The present carryover of grain in the world, that is the amount that will be carried over from the 1977 and earlier crops to the beginning of harvest in 1978, is a smaller percentage of world consumption than it was in 1971 on the eve of the world food crisis. We have a carryover now estimated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture of 181 million tons. That sounds like a lot of grain. But at the very bottom of that world food crisis, when everybody was going crazy about food shortages, we had 127 million tons. That is the bottom of the pipeline. That 127 to 135 or 140 million tons represents the minimum that you have to have in the pipeline before you can reasonably expect to get anything out of the top. Now, if I'm the kind of housekeeper that if I was going to water some plants in the second story of my house, I'd hitch up the garden hose to the faucet downstairs, and I'd run the hose upstairs to put a cup of water in the flower pot. And I'm trying to illustrate what this pipeline is all about. Now, what I want to get out of the top for my flower pot is about a cup full of water. But I'm going to have to put several gallons of water in that garden hose before I can get the cup of water out of the top. And before anybody can get any food out of the top of the food pipeline, you've got to have at least 127 million tons, as we found out in 1974, in the pipeline before anything will come out the top. And so the margin, the real reserve that's available to feed hungry people if they should appear anywhere in the world, or if anybody has trouble with their crop, the real margin is about 50 million tons. Not 181 million tons. World consumption of grain increases by 35 million tons every year. That's the normal increase in consumption of grain. And just that alone would almost wipe out that present reserve of grain if our crops don't expand for next year over what they were this year. Now that's how close we are to running out of grain in this world. The reduction in output of world grain in 1974 from the year before was about 52 million tons, just about the same as our present reserve. So the situation is that one bad crop in the world would wipe out the present reserve, and we'll be right back where we were in the so-called world food crisis of just a few years ago. And that, my friends, is the surplus that is giving this administration the excuse to bust farmers' prices to the lowest level in almost half a century. No, this is a reserve of a week's consumption of food. a reserve that is less than the reduction in output of one bad crop year isn't a burdensome surplus that justifies busting the farmer's price and keeping the farmer's price down in the world market. Those are excuses, but the real reason, I'm convinced, is a cheap food policy. If you look back at what has happened to prices, wages, fees, and commissions for the past 25, 30 years, you'll see one thing that is outstanding, and that is that farm prices, in relation to other prices, have been going down almost constantly all that time. Everything else has been going up almost constantly. And up until about 1972 or 1973, the reduction in farm prices almost totally offset the increase in everybody else's. And so the farmers have been taking the rap for everybody else's inflation for a quarter century in this country, and then we ran out of food in 1972 and 73, and the farm prices skyrocketed, and that turned the world economy into a tailspin. Now that's the history, the economic history of the past 30 years. And the government of the United States has now decided that there is still too much political pressure for other people's prices to go up, for wages to go up, for costs to go up, for commissions and fees and prices, everywhere else in the economy to go up. And those are tough problems to take on. The real cause of rising prices and what they call inflation, that's too politically tough to take on. And they take a look at the farmers, who have been absorbing everybody else's inflation for a generation, and the politicians figure that the farmer is the easiest goose to catch. So he's the one that's going to have to get plucked to make the pillow to soften life for everybody else. And that, my friends, is the reason that your prices are the lowest they've been in real purchasing power since the Hoover era. Well, that tells you something about the fix we're in as farmers. And it also tells something about the fix we're in the Farmers Union. Now, I suppose that most of us here are Democrats, and I confess to being a Democrat myself. We have Republicans in the Farmers Union, and we're a nonpartisan farmers organization. But I have to confess to you that those of us in the Farmers Union who are Democrats are very embarrassed about our present situation. And it puts the Farmers Union in an embarrassing situation because we have stressed political action. We have believed, and I have believed personally, all through the Benson years, if we can only elect a different kind of office holder, that the farmers can get parity or a reasonable approach to it. We believed it. Now we've got a farmer for president, and we've got a farmer for Secretary of Agriculture. But we've got the same old Benson and Nixon and Butts cheap food policy. And we have Hoover-era purchasing power for our products. And that puts the Farmers Union in one hell of a fix, along with the farmers. Now, I think this has brought us to a double-jointed turning point in history. This is a watershed, my friends. This means that history is changing, and our whole situation is different. And we're going to have to know what we're up against. We're going to have to appreciate that we're in a different kind of situation than we thought we were, or we may have been, and we're going to have to do something different. The first change is that I think that the promise of parity through political action is over. That is a political promise that was first made by progressive Republicans in the 1920s. Senator Haugen here in South Dakota, Senator Norris in Nebraska, Senator McNary in Oregon, Senator La Follette in Wisconsin. Progressive Republicans who invented the idea of parity and who raised it as a political promise to farmers was invented by progressive Republicans It was co-opted and taken over by Franklin Roosevelt and endorsed by Franklin Roosevelt. And in the process, Franklin Roosevelt made Democrats out of many, many progressive Republican farmers all over this country. And many of you have lived through that process, as I have. That promise was kept by Truman. And never while Truman was president for 8 years did farm prices average less than 100% of parity. And it averaged precisely 100% of parity in Truman's last year of 1952, and they have never been at parity since then. But the promise was renewed by President Kennedy, who promised parity of income. And I wrote the words that went into the Democratic Party platform promising parity of income, and I believe that that promise could have been kept. But we don't need to review the sorrowful history of that decade of the 60s, which torpedoed many of our hopes and dreams for justice for farmers and for the elimination of poverty and many other things. But now the promise of parity, I think, has been repudiated by Secretary Berglund and President Carter and by the Democratic Party so far. And I think that means we've got to think differently in the Farmers Union than we have. But there is another equally significant turning point in history, it seems to me. For more than a century, the farmers of North America and Australia and South America settled our farms, and for more than a century have been able to produce more than the world could buy at any decent kind of a price. We have had more than a century of surplus agricultural production capacity in this world. And now I am convinced that with a population of the world that is double what it was about 1930, more than double what it was when I was born, we are at the end of the ability to produce a surplus of food in this world. Yes, we'll have what appears to be a surplus. We'll have phony surpluses like we have now. But on the average, I am convinced, we're going to be on the short side of having enough food to supply the market. Not only too little food to supply the needs, but we're going to be on the short side of having enough food to supply the market of people who have money to spend. My friends, if we could reduce the unemployment rate by 1% in all of the rich countries in this world, we would be short of food right now. It is high unemployment, it's worldwide economic depression that accounts for the fact that we don't have a shortage of food today and decent prices. And if we could put just 1% of the workforce in the rich countries back to work, country by country, reduce our rate from 7 to 6%, Germany's from 4% down to 3%, and so on, just that alone would, within a few months, generate enough additional demand for food that we'd be at scratch. And that is a different situation, and I don't think that we're going to ever again get into a situation where we can produce a real surplus. And that is an important change in the situation. Now, what are we going to do about it in this new and different reality that we're living in? Well, in the first place, we've got to do something different. And in the second place, we can do something different. The change in the political promise, the end of the promise of parity, means that we've got to do something different. And the end of the condition of chronic food surplus means that we can do something different. And I think we can get some lessons by looking at what other people are doing. We've got another serious problem in our world economy right now. It's the steel industry. The American steel industry is being undersold in the world market. We can't meet the competition. Well, on the airplane to Minneapolis on my way out here to South Dakota Sunday night, I read an account in the New York Times about our steel industry. The average wage per hour in our steel industry in the United States is $12.22 an hour. The average in Japan is $6.31 an hour, just a little bit over half, just a shade over half of what our average salary is. The 100 hours of labor in the United States produces 8 1/3 tons of steel. 100 hours of labor in Japan, costing half as much, produces 9.5 tons of steel. Now you can see why the Japanese are underselling us in the steel market. But I don't hear the Secretary of Labor or the Secretary of Commerce telling the steel workers that they ought to go out and accept $2.67 an hour for their steel labor in order not to be undersold. Like Secretary Berglund says, farmers' prices should be set at so that we won't be undersold in the world market. And I don't hear the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of the Treasury telling the steel investors that they ought to be willing to accept a 1.5% return on their investment so that they won't be undersold in the world market. I don't hear that. That's the prescription for agriculture, but it isn't the prescription for the steel industry. Not at all. We're going to help our steel industry to maintain their wage levels and their steel company profits, and maybe to improve them. We're going to cut off imports, restrict imports. That'll raise the price of barbed wire and farm machines. And we're going to provide some easy credit and maybe some tax benefits and other things so that the steel companies and the steel workers can continue to get their rates of return. Why? I don't think it's because anybody thinks that steel workers and steel investors are better than people who work and invest in farming. I think the difference is that the steel industry is organized. The workers are organized, and there aren't very many steel workers in this country, not nearly as many as there are farmers, but the steel workers are backed up by the electrical workers and the coal miners and the carpenters and the other organized workers. And there aren't very many steel investors in this country, not nearly as many as there are people investing in farms, family farmers investing in their own farms. But the steel investors are organized into powerful corporations, and they're backed up by the business community. And so nobody tells them to go broke in order to stay competitive. We look for some other way. The political system will always do what comes easiest. And if there's an easy goose to pick, he loses the feathers to make everybody else comfortable. And that's where the farmers are at. And we're there because we're poorly organized. The farmers of the United States are the most poorly organized of any farmers in any civilized country in this world. Our farm organization system is really lousy in this country. And that goes for our general farm organizations, and it goes for our cooperatives. And I'm saying this after a lifetime of working for the Farmers Union and with the Farmers Union and supporting cooperatives. And I'm saying this out of a tradition. My father was a Farmers Union leader and a cooperative leader and a cooperative builder, and all of our work is not getting the job done that needs to be done. And the results are there to prove it, that we have the poorest prices in real terms since the Depression. I think we have to face the facts that we've got to do something different. And I'm saying this without discredit to all of us good people in the Farmers Union and in our cooperatives who have done our very best to build institutions that would help farmers, and have indeed built institutions that have done great things for farmers and have yet great things to do. Our Farmers Union program is symbolized by a triangle. You look on any Farmers Union literature and you'll see that triangle, and you all know what it means. Education is at the base. And then two sides, one is legislation, one is cooperation. When I first came into the Farmers Union back in the 20s and the 30s, we were in the Farmers Union concentrating on cooperation. And my father and your fathers built these cooperatives out here. Here's a couple of them right here in this town. They're all over this country, built by the Farmers Union. The Farmers Union has started and built more cooperatives than everybody else in the United States put together, and I'm proud of it. It's a great record of cooperative building. But then along came the New Deal. Cooperatives weren't saving the farms in the 1930s, and the Farmers Union shifted its emphasis to legislation. And I don't apologize either for what the Farmers Union did in that respect. The Farmers Union was the initiator of such legislation as rural electrification, farm credit, and many other things that have helped farmers, and supported the farm programs, which helped save those of us who survive today. But now, I think we have got to quit running on a single track at a time. We ran on cooperation track, then we shifted our major emphasis over to the political action track. Now I think we've got to fire up a new locomotive on that cooperation track, and we've got to run full steam ahead, just as hard and fast as we can go, to build a new generation of cooperatives, to provide fully adequate service to our farm people. But at the same time, we got to build up a bigger head of steam than ever before on that legislation track. And we've got to run full steam ahead as hard and fast as we can go, not only to get legislative gains for farmers, but also to protect what we're going to have to try to do on the cooperation track. If farmers start getting organized, it's going to be opposed, just as everything we've ever done has been opposed, just as building our cooperatives in the first place was opposed. And if we start getting farmers organized, we're going to have to be prepared to fight politically and through legislative action to protect and to promote and to advance that fight. So this doesn't mean abandoning what we've been doing. It just means doing more of what we've been doing and maybe doing it a little differently. And I want to talk now about what we should be aiming for in this new drive to build cooperatives. And again, look at what's going on in the world around us. Consider the oil exporting countries, just as a model to look at. Not necessarily to imitate, but just maybe we can learn something. I first became aware of what was going on in the oil exporting countries about 10, 15 years ago when they started holding some meetings. They started talking to each other. And at that time, we had about 15 poor, backward countries, ignorant. Some of them didn't have a single college graduate. Some of my friends at the University of Wisconsin taught the first college graduate in a country like Libya, while just in the 1950s. And they were backward and ignorant and dumb, and everybody thought that they could never amount to anything. Now, does that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound like something that we have said about ourselves as farmers? Doesn't that sound about like many people regard farmers? Well, they didn't let that stop them. They looked around at their situation, they decided there's something they could do about it. Now, they might have said, we're going to do like the farmers out in South Dakota and Wisconsin. We're going to try to organize so we get control all the way from the ground, which they had just gotten ownership of when colonialism was disbanded at the end of World War II. We're going to try to get control of the entire economic chain all the way from the ground in Kuwait, let's say, to the consumer, all the way to the gas pump. And they already own the ground. They could nationalize the wells and the pumps, and then they could build pipelines. They could borrow money from the World Bank and build refineries and get a line of ships, to tankers to haul the stuff to Europe and America and Japan, and they could have bought a chain of filling stations, and they could have taught little Arabs how to pump gas check for oil and wash the windshields. And if they had done that and organized all the way from the ground to the consumer, they might have made, if they could beat Exxon at its own game, with all the experience that Exxon has got, all the interconnecting banking, financial resources and everything else. They might have done that if they were successful and lucky. And they might have made about 5 cents a gallon more on the gas that they could have gotten back to Kuwait. But they didn't do it that way. They looked around and they saw that 13 countries control 85% of the supply of petroleum that moves in world trade. And they already owned the ground, and the oil is in the ground. And they organized the control they already had, which is just control of the oil in the ground. And they bargained for a price. They said, well, we control so much of it, we'll set our price. And they didn't increase their price 5 cents. They increased it 5 times within a few months. And they made it stick. And I think we farmers now need to look at what the oil exporting countries have done. They're very much in the same boat we're in, or they were. And we're trying to organize all the way from the wheat farm to the flour mill and maybe the grocery store. That's our aim, to organize vertically and get a small part of the supply in one co-op and a small part of the supply in another co-op, and see if we can get all the way to the consumer and squeeze the middleman's margin and maybe shake out a couple cents a bushel back to the farmer by squeezing the profits. If we could invest all the money that it'll take to acquire a major part of the food business, all the processing plants and retail establishments and all the rest, well, we might keep on trying to do that. But I say that farmers already control almost 100% of the supply of their products before they leave the farm. And that's where farmers should organize. We should organize the control of the product that we already have while it's still in the farmer's hands, like the oil exporting countries have done. And they didn't need to spend a nickel, invest a nickel on even pumps and wells and anything else. They hire the oil companies to do their work for them, but they get their price. And farmers have to be organized horizontally so that we'll organize the control of the product that we already have at the farm through bargaining associations, marketing associations, whatever you want to call them. A different kind of cooperative that moves in the opposite direction, horizontally instead of vertically. And then, I don't say that we can increase our price 5 times. I don't even say that we ought to increase it 2 times too soon. I'm not so sure that we ought to increase the price of wheat immediately to parity. I think that the world could stand it. I don't think it would spoil farmers, but it might upset the political apple cart and invite more trouble than making a modest increase and working it up more realistically and at a more moderate pace. But I'm not going to prejudge that issue. I think that we ought to get farmers organized into associations so that they control their product, and then let the farmers figure out what to do and use the best judgment they can. I'm now working with other farm organization leaders and cooperative leaders in drafting a bill for national legislation that would facilitate the formation of bargaining associations of farmers. Now, we don't need anything more than the Capper-Volstead Act that we've got, but additional legislation will make it a little better. And in the course of this work, I've gotten acquainted with the manager of a tomato growers cooperative in California. They have, I suppose, about maybe 2,000 farmers in their co-op. They account not for anything like 100% of the tomato crop, but about 60%. And they've been in operation 5 years. And 5 years ago, when they started, in their first year, farmers got $28 a ton for tomatoes, for making tomato soup and canned tomatoes and so on. Last year, they got $56.80 a ton. That's 80 cents more than double their price in 5 years of bargaining. That shows what can be done with tomatoes. That doesn't necessarily prove it can be done with livestock or wheat. We are now working with tomato growers in Indiana and Ohio to organize a tomato co-op. The Farmers Union about 5 years ago started a milk producers cooperative in Wisconsin. It has members in Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan, Illinois. It has the second largest dairy cooperative membership of the whole state of Wisconsin, which is the biggest dairy state. That organization is organized horizontally, and it is organized with the aim of getting control of the milk supply to enable farmers to bargain for a price and for other terms of sale. We are already strong enough and big enough so that plant by plant we can insist that we want our representative checking the milk test to make sure that the farmer is being paid on an honest test. And that is saving money for farmers and making money for farmers. And we're just about at the point where we can start bargaining effectively for milk prices, even though we don't control anything like the national supply. And one of the most important victories of that cooperative is that its work succeeded in playing off Jimmy Carter and Mo Udall against each other in the presidential primary and getting Mo Udall to promise 90% of parity, and Jimmy Carter came along with 85% of parity promise. And that is why milk is about 20% of parity higher on present prices than wheat. Well, we need to get farmers organized, I think, commodity by commodity in bargaining associations. And these bargaining associations cannot be permitted to just go off in all directions, with pork producers fighting beef producers, fighting cheese producers, fighting soybean farmers. We've got to keep them all under a general farm organization tent so that farmers who produce each commodity can represent their interests and resolve their conflicts and differences with other producers among ourselves.